In this Blender tutorial, I will show you how to create this procedural sci-fi metal plating material. This procedural material is available for purchase on my Gumroad store, and you can also get access to this procedural material if you join my Patreon page. And checking out my Gumroad store and Patreon page are great ways to help support me and this channel. And as you may know, I create a lot of procedural material tutorials, and so every time I create another 10 procedural materials, I create a Blender procedural material pack. And so I've just released Blender procedural material pack number 8. So if you'd like to check out that Blender procedural material pack as well as my other procedural material packs, I will have the links in the description. And purchasing the packs is also a great way to help support me. And if you'd like to learn how to create all of my procedural materials, then you can also check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. Alright, now for this tutorial, I am going to be using the Cycles render engine because I'm going to be using the displacements in the node editor to actually make the sci-fi plating pop out. So if you want to use the displacements, then you are going to need to use Cycles render, and Cycles render is also just more realistic. And then I'm also going to be using the adaptive displacement, so where the camera is closer up to the mesh, it's going to add more detail, but then where the material is farther away, it'll add less detail. So if you want to use the adaptive displacements, then you'll need to be in Cycles render, and on the feature set here, you're going to need to change the feature set to experimental. So in the 3D viewport, I added a plane, and then I went into edit mode and I subdivided the plane. Now why I'm subdividing it is because I want to give it a lot more detail so that the displacements actually has detail to work with. So I just subdivided the plane so it's very detailed. And then right over here, if you go to the modifier properties, I also gave this object the subdivision surface modifier, and then back over here on the render properties, because I set the feature set to experimental, I can check mark the adaptive subdivision, and that way it'll use the adaptive displacement. So then on the dicing scale, I just set this to like a 5. And then also make sure you have the object selected, and right here I have the shader editor. So I'm just going to click on new here to add a new material. So now that we've added a new material, I'm going to go right over here to the material properties and then just open up the settings tab right here. And then down here under surface on the displacement, I'm going to change this to displacement and bump. And this way we are telling the material that it can actually use the displacement. And then back over here in the 3D view, I also just added a camera and I pointed the camera right down there looking at the plane. Now for the lighting, I added in these 2 plane lights. So these are just some planes, and then they have an emission material to them with a strength of 20. And I also gave them a slight blue color, so they look kind of sci-fi and they'll give some nice bright lighting to our material. And then also you can click right here on the world properties, and let me show you the world that I created to get some nice lighting and reflections. So to add in the HDRI, you can click right over here on the world properties, and then if you don't already have a world in your scene, you can just click on new to add a new world. Now right here on color, I'm going to click on this yellow dot, and I'm going to go over here under texture, and I'm going to add the environment texture. And then I can click on open to open up the HDRI. And here's the HDRI that I'm using. So this is the Aerodynamics Workshop 1K HDR, and this is a free HDRI from a website called polyhaven.com. So if you'd like to download the same HDRI, I will have the link in the description. So I'm just going to double click on this to open it up. And so this is going to give some nice lighting and reflections on the metal. And then if you want to set up the world the exact same way that I did, then over here on the shader editor, you can click on object and you can go to a world. And there's actually a node system for the world. Now I don't want this HDRI to be very bright. I want it to be kind of darker, and that way it'll look like it's kind of in a dark room, and I think it looks more sci-fi. So on the background right here, on this background node, you could also do it right here to change the strength, but I can also change it right here. So I'm going to turn the strength to a 0.25, just a 0.25, and now you can see that HDRI is much less bright, and so these lights right here are more bright. And then I also want to get rid of any of the colors because I just want the HDRI to be black and white. So I'm going to press Shift A, I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for the hue saturation node, and let's drop this right in here between the Aerodynamics Workshop and the background. And then I'm just going to take the saturation value and I'm going to turn that to 0. And that way there isn't going to be any colors, so it'll basically just be a black and white HDRI. And you can't see it in the background, but that's because I went to the render properties, and on the film here, I just checked mark this transparent. So you can see there's the HDRI, but using this hue saturation value, we are making it black and white. And then under film, I'm just going to check mark the transparent so we can't see it. And then also to really pop out the colors and make it look nicer, under the color management, I'm going to set the view transform transform to filmic, and then I'm going to set the look to very high contrast. And that'll pop out the colors and make things more contrasty and saturated. So I'm going to click right back here on world, and I'm going to go back to the object so we can preview the shader nodes for the objects. And then I am also going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on. To enable the add-on, you can just click on Edit and open up the preferences. And then if you go over there to the add-ons tab, you can search for Node Wrangler and just checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on. All right, so we've already added a new material to this plane. And if you go right over here to the material properties under settings, we already set the displacement to displacement and bump so it can actually use the displacement. So I'm just going to make this much smaller, and then let's rename this material. I'm going to rename this material to Procedural Sci-Fi Metal Plating. And also here in the 3D view, I'm in the camera's perspective, and I also went into the rendered view by holding down the Z button and moving my mouse up into the rendered view. So to start off, we are going to be creating the texture for the metal plating. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. Let's drop the Voronoi texture right down here. And then because we turned on the Node Wrangler add-on, I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture, and that is going to preview the texture on the object. And then with the Voronoi texture still selected, let's also press Control T, and that is going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And then I want to use the object coordinates. So let's take this object right here, and I'm going to put this into the vector of the mapping. And the object coordinates is going to place the texture on the object more evenly. And then this procedural material setup will get a little bit complicated. So I do want to organize it very well so that you don't get confused. And hopefully that way you will be able to understand more what everything does. So what I'm going to do is select the texture coordinate, hold down the Shift key, and then select the mapping. I'm now going to press Control J. And Control J is going to add a frame. Now let's rename this frame. So I'm going to press the N key, and that's going to open up the side panel. And if you click right over here on Node, you can add a label. So I'm going to rename this to Mapping. And now you can see there is the mapping right there. And I'm just going to make this kind of small, but I'm going to leave it here because we are going to be renaming quite a few different things just so that we can organize the nodes better. And then let's click on this mapping node. So actually click on the mapping node, and we can make a label for this as well. So I'm going to rename this to texture scale because we can use this mapping node to scale the entire material. So all of the nodes, all of the textures are going to be plugged through this texture scale. So then what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to click on this X scale value, drag down, and then I can drag back and forth, and that's going to change all the values at the same time. And so we'll be able to scale the texture to whatever size you want. But for now, I'll just leave the scale set to 1. Now on this Voronoi texture, I want to make it look more sci-fi. So let's click on this setting right here, and I'm going to change this to the Chebyshev. So now if you look at the preview, you can see that we have all these little squares. Now the squares are kind of randomly placed, and I want them to be more straight. So let's take the randomness value, and I'm going to drag that all the way down to 0. So now we're getting this really cool pattern with all of these squares. Now I want to make these squares much more contrasty and sharp because you can see they are very gray. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. Let's click on the color ramp, and I can just drop it right in here. So the distance is going to go into the factor of the color ramp. And then make sure you Control Shift and select the color ramp to preview it. So I'm actually going to click on this arrow right here, and I'm going to click on Flip Color Ramp. That is going to flip both of the colors. And I can now start to drag these together. So drag the two tabs together, and you can see as I drag them closer and closer together, they're going to be much more contrasty. So there we go. Now we're getting all these squares, sort of like a checkerboard, and I'm just going to bring these together very close. So I'm just going to stick both of these tabs, the white tab and the black tabs, right about there. So you can see that is very sharp now, and so we now have this really cool texture with all these white squares. Now I want the edges of the squares to be kind of beveled to make it look cool and very sci-fi. So what I'm going to do is click on this Voronoi texture, and then I'm going to press Control Shift D. So normally Shift D will duplicate nodes, but if you press Control Shift D, that will duplicate the node, but it's going to keep everything plugged up to it. And then I want to preview this node, so I'm going to Control Shift and select the Voronoi texture to preview it. And then on both of these Voronoi textures, I want to take the scale value and I want to turn them to 2. So the scale value to 2 on this one, and also the scale value to 2 on this one. And that is pretty important that the scale is both set to 2. So if you want to change the scale of this texture, you can do that with the texture scale by clicking, dragging down, and then dragging back and forth. But I do specifically want to set the scale values to 2 on both of the Voronoi textures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these squares from this Voronoi texture, and I'm going to put put the squares in the middle and make them a bit smaller. And then we are going to use that and mix it together with this texture right here. If I control shift and select the color ramp, you can see we have these squares. So we're going to use this Voronoi texture to put some other squares in between these squares, so right where those black lines connect, and then that way each square is going to have a bevel. So I'm going to control shift and select this Voronoi texture again. So what I'm going to do is click on the Chebyshev, and I'm going to change this instead to Manhattan. So I'm going to change it to Manhattan, and now we have this texture right here. It's a little bit different. It kind of looks like some stars. Now I want to make this more contrasty as well. So I'm going to click on this color ramp, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to stick it right here on this wire from the viewer node, and then just make sure the distance is going into the factor. And make sure you control shift and select the color ramp to preview it. So these squares are way too big. You can see they're going through each other. So I'm going to drag the black tab over here. I'm just going to drag it to about there. And then I'm going to drag the white tab over as well. So it's pretty contrasty. Not super contrasty, but pretty contrasty. Something like that is pretty good. Now I want these black squares to be in the very center of where the X mark is on this texture. If I control shift and select this color ramp, you can see there's the X mark right there. But then if I control shift select this color ramp, you can see it's just white right there. So what I need to do is I need to shift all of these squares over. So to do this, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the vector math node. Let's click on the vector math node, and I'm going to drop it right in here between this wire going from the mapping to this second Voronoi texture. So just drop it there, and I can just kind of bring this over, bring this back, and bring this back as well, so it's nice and neat. So what I can do is I can use this vector math node to actually change where it's placed. So you can see if I drag this, if I drag these values, that's going to change the placement of it. Now these three numbers here represent the X, Y, and Z axis. So this one down here, this bottom one, this is the Z axis, and so that's going up and down. But I don't want to move the Z axis, I just want to move the X and Y. So I'm going to click with my mouse, drag down once, and then let go. This way we can change both of the values at the same time. So I'm going to type in a value of 0.75. So 0.75 and hit enter. And that way it's just going to shift these squares over. So now if I hold down the control and shift key and click between these two color ramps, you can see where these squares are. They're in the center of where those black lines are. So now I can just mix these two textures together. So I'm going to select this color ramp, and then I'm going to hold down the shift key and select this color ramp. Then I'm going to press Control 0. So Control 0 is going to add this mix RGB, and I can click on the arrow to open it up and just drag it right over here. So right now you can see that it's just mixing both of the values together evenly, and if I drag the factor, it's going to go between one or the other, so color 1 and color 2. But instead of just mixing between them, I just want to add the dark values. So I'm going to click on the mix here, and instead I'm going to change it to darken. And then on the factor, I'm just going to turn this all the way up to 1. So this way it is just adding those dark values from both of the color ramps, and so now you can see that we have this really cool texture here, and those white squares that we have are now beveled. So this texture right here is going to be the displacement. So where it is white, the mesh is going to be popping out, but then where it is black, the mesh is going to be going back down. And also you can see right here on the edge, there is a tiny little bit of grayness, and that is because I left a little bit of room between the color ramps. If I drag these color ramps together closer, they're going to be very, very sharp, but I do just want just a tiny little gray area, and that way as it goes from black to white, it's slowly going to go up, and so that is going to create kind of a bevel on that mesh. So again, I want to organize the node setup very well so that you understand everything that's going on. So I'm going to press the A key a few times to make sure everything is deselected. And then I'm going to press B for the box select. And I'm going to drag a box around all of these nodes. And then I'm going to press Control J. So Control J is going to add a frame. And I can also just like push these together a little bit if I want to make that frame a little bit smaller. And then I can click on the frame, and right over here on the label, I want to rename this to displacement texture. So let's make this a little bit bigger. I can rename this to displacement texture because this is the texture for the displacement. So now we can take this data and we can add it into the displacement to give it some bump. So let's take this color right here, and I'm going to plug this into the displacement. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader to preview it. So now if you zoom out here, you can see it's definitely displacing the mesh, but something is very wrong. The displacement is really messed up, and that is because this is color data because it has a yellow dot, but then this over here, this needs to be displacement data because it is a purple dot. So we need a node in here to convert the color data into displacement data. So to do this, let's press Shift Shift A. I'm going to go to the search, and let's search for the displacement node. And I'm going to click on the displacement node, and I'm going to drop it right here in between this wire, and then I can just drag it right down here, and I'm going to stick it underneath the principled shader. And I can also drag this displacement texture down and maybe bring the mapping back a little bit, so we have a bit more space. Now I'm going to go back over to the displacement texture, and I actually want to take the color from the darken, and I want to plug this into the height value, and that way it's going to convert this data into displacement data. You can see it goes in gray and then it comes out purple, so now it is proper displacement data and it can go into the displacement of the material output. So now if you take a look at our object, you can see those metal plates are popping out. Now they're popping out way too much, they're really big, and so I want to make it less strong. So on the scale value right here, I'm going to turn the scale to a 0.025. So a 0.025, that way they're going to be much less strong, but if I go into the camera view, you can see those are definitely popping out, and we now have those cool metal plates. And then also on the mid-level, I find that for this material, it works better if I just turn the mid-level to 0. I think that looks better. And there we go. So we now have some really cool displacement. And if you look at this on side view, you can definitely see that the mesh is actually popping out. So that is very cool. All right, now as well as using this texture in the displacement, I also want to put it into the normal right here to give it some fake bump. So let's take this color, and we are going to put it into the normal. Now again, we need to convert this to normal data because this is purple and this is normal data, but then this here is color data, it's yellow. So to convert this color data to normal data, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and let's drop the bump node right in here in this wire, and that's going to plug it up. And then to actually convert this data to normal data, we actually want to take the color and we want to put that into the height value. And then let's click on this bump, and I'm going to open up this side tab right here. And on the label here, I'm going to call this plating bump because we are going to have multiple layers of bump. So I just want to name it very well so it's very easy to understand. So this is the plating bump. Now, if I select this displacement node, I can press the M key, and the M key is going to mute this node. So now if I zoom in here, you can see this is what the plating bump is doing. So this is what the fake bump is doing, the normal here. So if I kind of look at this on the side, you can see it's not actually popping out the mesh, but it appears as though it's popping out the mesh. And this will just help to make it look like it's bumping out a bit more. And also, if you didn't want to use the displacement, if you're using Blender Eevee and you didn't want to use the displacement, you could just use the plating bump instead. But I am going to be using the displacement and the bump as well. Now the displacement is a bit laggy and it kind of slows down the rendering in the viewport. So I'm going to keep this muted for now so we can't see it, but then I will unmute this at the end before we actually render the final thing. All right, so the next texture that we're going to be creating is the sci-fi texture. So I'm going to do it right up here. So I'm going to do it above this displacement texture. So to start off, I'm going to press Shift A, and let's go right here to the search, and I'm going to search for the brick texture. So we're going to add the brick texture right here. And then I want all of the textures to be plugging into the texture scale so that I can scale the mapping node and it's going to scale the entire thing. So let's take the vector and we're going to put that into the vector of the brick texture. And I also want to use the object coordinates on the texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the brick texture to preview it. Now I want to use another texture to distort this brick texture and make it look more sci-fi. So I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture, and we're going to stick the Voronoi texture right here. So this way, this Voronoi texture is going to actually distort the brick texture because it is going through the vector. And so the vector data is how the texture is placed on the object. So by putting this through here, it's going to distort the placement of the brick texture. And then I actually want to take the distance and I want to plug this into the vector instead because I want to use the distance, not the color. And then on the Voronoi texture, I'm going to take the 3D and I'm going to instead turn that to 4D. And then also on the F1 here, I want to use F2 instead. And then to make it look very sci-fi, you can see it looks kind of circular and round right now, but to make it more sci-fi, I'm going to take this value and I'm going to change this instead to the Chebyshev. So now we're getting a really cool procedural sci-fi texture, and that is looking really cool. And then also on the scale here, I want to turn this up to like a 6. And then on the brick texture, I'll just leave all the settings as they are on default. Now I also want to mix this sci-fi texture with a noise texture. So I'm going to bring the Voronoi up and bring the brick up. And then I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a noise texture. Let's click on the noise texture, and I'm just going to drop it right down here, kind of in front of the brick texture. And then again, I'm going to take the vector from the texture scale, and let's put this into the vector of the noise texture. And then I can Control Shift and select the noise texture texture to preview it. And then I want this noise texture to be very detailed, so let's turn the detail all the way to the max, which is 15, and then let's also take this roughness value, and I'm going to turn this up to like a 0.6, so there's a little bit more roughness. So now we have some really nice detail there in that texture. Now before we continue, I want to put all of these in a frame as well, so press the A key to make sure everything is deselected. I can then press B for the box select, just box select these 3 nodes, and then you can press Ctrl J, and again Ctrl J is going to create this frame and it'll put them in the frame. And then if you select that frame, we can change the label, so I'm going to rename this to Sci-Fi Texture. And then also if you want to, you can see this wire is going behind these textures. So what I'm going to do is hold down the Shift key and then right click and drag. So hold down the Shift key and right click and drag. That's going to add this little line, and when you let go, it's going to add this reroute. So then you can drag the reroute around. It's not going to change the actual look of the texture, but it'll just make the preview look a little bit nicer. So it'll go down and then go over. You could also press Shift A, go to the search and search for a reroute, and then you can plug things up to it. So totally optional, you can do that if you want to. All right, so we now have our noise texture and we also have the sci-fi texture, and I want to mix these two together. So I'm going to select the noise texture, hold down the Shift key and select the brick texture. I can now press Ctrl 0, and Ctrl 0 is going to add this mix here. So let's open this up, so it's a mix RGB, and I'm going to stick it in the sci-fi texture so it's inside the frame and drag it over. Now I actually want to take the mix here and I want to instead change this to lighten. So it's right here, the lighten, and why I'm changing it to lighten is because I only want to add the light values. And then I'm going to take this noise texture and I'm going to unplug the wire and actually plug it up into color 1, and then this way the brick texture will go into color 2. And then I'm going to leave the factor at 0.5, so it's kind of evenly blending between the brick texture and the noise texture. So now if I zoom in here, you can definitely see that sci-fi detail from the brick texture, and all of that noise there in the noise texture will give some nice detail to the sci-fi metal. So now what I want to do is I want to take this color here from the lighten, and I actually want to put this into the roughness value of the principled, and that way some places are going to be a bit more rough and some places are going to be a bit more shiny. So let's take the color and I'm going to put that into the roughness, and then I can hold down the Control and Shift key and select the principled BSDF to preview it. And then also, because this is a metal material, I want to take this metallic value and I'm going to turn it all the way up to 1, so it's actually treated as a metallic material. And now you can see that this is very shiny. And if you look closely, you can definitely see that there's some variation in the roughness. Now I want to have more control over the roughness, so I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. Let's click on the color ramp and I can just drop it right here between this mix RGB and the roughness. So now I can change the values of the color ramp, and that's going to change how rough or shiny the metal is. So I'm going to drag the black tab out a bit, just drag it a little bit out, and then I'm also going to drag the white tab out a bit as well. So this way they're a bit more contrasty. And if I Control Shift select the color ramp, you can see what it's doing. So by dragging these values together, they're a bit more contrasty and I can see the black and white values a bit better. And then also I want to click on this white tab, and actually real quick I'm going to Control Shift and just select the principled BSDF again. So if I click on this white tab, if I make it darker, it's going to be more shiny. So you can see that is now super shiny. It's basically like a mirror. But then if I make it more and more white, it's going to be more rough. So I do want it to be pretty shiny because it is metal, so I'm going to make it a little bit darker. So now if you zoom in there, you can definitely see there's some variation. So some parts are a bit more rough, but then other parts are a bit more shiny. And then I can also click on the color ramp, just make sure the color ramp is selected. And on the label here, I can just rename this to roughness. Again, just so that everything is very organized and neat and we know what everything is doing. All right, so now I'm going to continue to work on this sci-fi texture, and we're going to be creating the color, and we're going to plug that into the principled shader. So if I Control Shift and select this brick texture, this texture has all of this sci-fi detail right here. But I don't want all of this sci-fi detail to be everywhere because I don't want it to be on the metal plates. I just want this sci-fi detail to be underneath the metal plates. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A, and let's go here to the search, and I'm going to search for another mix RGB, and I'm going to stick the mix RGB right here, and I'm not going to put it in the sci-fi texture frame. And so I want to use this mix RGB to mix the sci-fi texture and the displacement texture together, because the displacement texture is where the metal plating is. So I'm going to take this darken value from the displacement texture, I'm going to pull out a wire, and I'm going to plug that into the factor of this new mix which we just added. So now if if you look around here, you can see that there is this white sci-fi plating on top of this other texture. Now, if you zoom in here, you can see that it's kind of faded on the edges, and I don't want it to be faded. I want it to be sharp on the edges. So to make it sharp, we're going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp. Let's click on the color ramp, and I'm just going to drop it in here in between this wire between the darken and this new mix RGB. So just drop it right there when that wire turns that lighter color. And I'm also going to press A to deselect everything. I'm going to press B for the box select. Just box select all these nodes, and I'll press G to grab, and I'm just going to move them over a bit so we have a little bit more space. Now again, to organize this very well, I'm going to be adding a frame. So I'm going to select this mix, hold down the Shift key and select this color ramp, and then I can press Ctrl J, and Ctrl J is going to add this frame. And again, I want to press A to deselect everything. I'll press B for the box select. I'm just going to drag a box around these nodes here. So the displacement, the bump, the roughness, and the principled, and I'm just going to bring these over so there's a little bit more space. So then this frame, I'm just going to bring kind of right down here, and on the frame label, if you go to the label here on this side panel, I'm going to rename this to color because this is going to be the color for the shader. So now back to the color ramp, I can use this color ramp to make it more contrasty on those edges. So I'm going to click on the white tab, and I'm going to drag the white tab over, and as I drag it over, you can see that those edges are becoming much more sharp. So I'm going to continue to drag this way over, and I'm going to drag it very, very close so that the edges of that plating is very sharp. All right, that's looking pretty good. But if I look here where the sci-fi details are, you can see they're pretty much just white and black. And so I want to change these colors as well to make them more gray. And that way there's going to be gray colors underneath the plating. So to make the colors more gray, I need to add another color ramp right in here between the brick texture and the mix within this color here. So I'm going to press Shift A, let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and let's stick the color ramp right in here. And I'm just going to bring this up here and make sure it is in the color frame. So I can now change the colors in this color ramp, and that's going to change the colors of the sci-fi details. So I'm first going to click on the black tab, and I'm going to drag this black tab over so it's a little bit more contrasty. And then I'm going to click on this color, and I'm going to make this kind of a grayish color. And I'll make it a bit lighter, so something like that. Then I'm going to hold down the Control key and click right there, and that's going to add another tab. And then this tab, if I click on this color, I'm going to make this a bit darker so everything is a bit darker. And then I will hold down the Control key and click again, and that's going to add another tab. And this tab, I am going to again make it even darker because I definitely want a lot of the sci-fi details to be darker. And you don't have to do this exactly the same way that I'm doing it. You can just do whatever you think looks nice. But I'm now going to take this white tab, and I'm going to drag this white tab over a little bit so it's a bit more contrasty. And then I don't want it to be super white, so I'm going to click on this color right here, and I'm going to make this a bit darker as well. And then I can also hold down the Control key and click right here in between these two ones, and this is going to add another color, and I'm going to make this a little bit brighter. And of course you can play around where these are placed, and you can play around with the gray colors. I'm going to go with something like this, so we have a few different colors, and they're a bit gray, some lighter gray and some darker gray, so you can just get your sci-fi details to look something like this. Now you can see the metal plates are actually just kind of a light gray, and I want to make those brighter. So on color 2 right here, I can make this fully bright, and that way those plates right there are going to be really bright. So now I can take this mix here, I can take the color, and I'm going to plug this into the base color of the principled. And then I can Control Shift and select the principled to preview that. So that is looking really cool. Now those plates, those metal plates are lighter, but then right here where the sci-fi details are, that is darker. All right, so the next thing that I want to create is a texture for some bolts. So we're going to have some bolts here and there in between those metal plates. So I'm going to be creating the bolt texture right up here. So to create this bolt texture, I'm going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for a Voronoi texture. Let's just put the Voronoi here. And then again, I want to put this mapping into the Voronoi. So I'm going to take the vector. Let's put that into the vector on the Voronoi. And that way, if I ever want to scale the texture, I can just scale the scale values on this mapping, and that's going to scale all of the textures. And then I can Control Shift and select this Voronoi to preview it. So you can see that there's a bunch of little dots in this Voronoi, and they're just kind of randomly placed, and that is because the randomness value is turned to 1, but I don't want it to be random. I want it to be very uniform and straight. So let's take the randomness all the way down to 0, and now we have this really cool texture here with these little dots. And then also I want to turn the scale to 4. Make sure you turn the scale to 4. That is very important, because if the scale is set to 4, that's going to work properly with the displacement texture. So basically all of these little dots right here are going to be in between these metal plating. Now these bolts are not very contrasty, and I want them to be pretty contrasty, so they're much smaller. So let's press Shift A. I'm going to go to the search, and I'm going to search for a color ramp, and we're going to add the color ramp, and I'm going to stick it right here. So the distance will go into the factor. So I can now start to drag these together, and you can see that it's going to be more contrasty. So I'm just going to drag this black tab out a little bit so that it's a bit darker, but then I can drag the white tab really, really close, and that way those bolts are going to be pretty small. So just something like that. And then to organize my nodes very well, I'm going to select the Voronoi texture, hold down the Shift key and select the color ramp, and then I can press Ctrl J. That's going to add this frame here. And if you click on the frame and go over to the side panel, you can rename the label. So I'm going to rename this to bolts texture. Okay, bolts texture. Now I don't want these bolts to be on the plating. I only want them to be where the sci-fi details are. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the texture from the displacement texture, and we're going to mix that with the bolts texture, and we're going to put the displacement texture on top so that where the metal plating is, it's going to be on top of those bolts, and you won't be able to see the bolts where the metal plating is. So what I'm going to do right here on this color is I'm going to bring the mix RGB down so we have some more space. So I'm now going to press Shift A. Let's go to the search, and I'm going to search for another mix RGB, and we're going to stick the mix RGB right here in this color. And then on the mix here, I actually want to click on this, and I want to change it to lighten because I just want to add the light values. So now if I Control Shift and select this color ramp right here, this is the mask for where those metal plating is. So I'm going to take the color and I'm going to plug that up to the factor on this lighten, and then I can Control Shift and select the lighten to preview it. So I can now go right up here to this bolt texture, and I'm going to take the color and we are going to plug this into color 1 on the lighten. So now I can take color 2 and I can make that darker or lighter. And so if I make it fully black, you're able to see all the bolts, but then as I make color 2 lighter and lighter, it's going to hide those bolts where the metal plating is. As I'm making this lighter, they're disappearing. So I'm going to turn color 2 to fully white, and that way you aren't able to see the bolts where the metal plating is. So I now just want to combine these two together because this is the original color, which is going into the base color, but I want to be able to see the bolts in the color. So we are going to mix the lighten with the mix. So just select the lighten, hold down the Shift key, select the mix, and then you can press Control 0, and Control 0 is going to add this mix. Let's open it up, and I'm going to stick it right here in this color. So stick it in the color and bring it over. And then also this is getting a little bit big, so I'm going to press A to deselect everything. I'll press B for the box select, and again I'm just going to box select these nodes and bring them over. Basically I just don't want this roughness to be on top of this color. So we have a little bit more space, and then I can Control Shift and select this mix to preview it. So what I want to do is I want to take this lighten and I want to put it into the factor. And then this bottom mix is going to go into color 2. So this way, color 1 is going to be the color of the bolts. So if I zoom in here, you can see there's the bolts. And if I change color 1, if I make it darker, that's going to change the color of the bolts. So I'm going to make color 1 kind of just like a dark gray color, so the bolts are kind of a dark gray. So I'm now going to take this mix instead, and we are going to plug the color into the base color, and that way instead of using this one, we are using this one which has the bolts. So I can now Control Shift and select the principled BSDF, and you can see there's the bolts. Now the bolts aren't popping out at all, and so I want to also add them into the normal to give them some bump, because right now they just kind of look like a little shadow, and they don't have any bump. So if I Control Shift and select this lighten right here, this lighten is the texture for where the bolts are. So I can put this into the normal. So what I'm going to do is select this bump, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate the bump, and I'm going to stick it right here after the first bump. So then the normal can go through the normal, but we now have this extra height value that we can add data into. So what I'm going to do is take this color from the lighten, and we're going to stick that into the height value of this bump. And also on this bump, let's click on the bump, and over here on the label, I'm just going to rename it to bolt bump. So now I can Control Shift and select the principled BSDF to preview that. Now if you zoom in there, it actually kind of looks like the bolts are going back in, and I want the bolts to be popping out. So let's click on this invert button on the bolts bump, click on the invert, and now it looks like those little bolts are popping out. So that is really cool, and it adds a lot more detail to our material. And then let's also create another frame for these bump nodes. So I'm going to select the bolts bump, hold down the Shift key, select the plating bump, and then I can press Control J. Control J is going to add add this frame here. And if I click on the frame, I'm just going to go to the label here and I'm going to rename this to normal. So just rename that to normal, or you could also rename it to bump. Now you can see that this wire is kind of going over the normal. To fix this, I can just add a reroute. So I can hold down the shift key and then right click and drag, and that's going to add the cut there. And when I let go, it's going to add the reroute, and I can just pull the reroute over, just kind of get it out of the way. And then if I zoom in here to the bolts, if you want the bolts to look like they're popping out less, you can turn the strength value down. So if you turn it all the way down to 0, now they look very flat, but I want to turn it up all the way to 1 so it looks like they're popping out a lot. Now again, if I zoom in close, the sci-fi details look very smooth, and so I want to add them into the bump as well to give them some bump too. So I'm going to click on the bolts bump, click on this node, and I'm going to press Shift D to duplicate it, and we're going to stick it right in here. So stick it in this wire in between the plating bump and the bolts bump. And then I can click on this bolts bump here, the one that's in the middle, and I can just rename this to sci-fi bump. All right, sci-fi bump. So if I control shift and select this bottom mix right here in the color, here's the texture for the sci-fi details. So I can take this color and I'm going to plug this into the height value of the sci-fi bump. And then if I control shift and select the sci-fi bump, you can see what it's doing. So it's going to add a little bit of bump where those sci-fi details are. And then I don't want them to be super strong. So on the strength here, I'm just going to turn this to like a 0.5. So it's not quite as strong. And then if you want to, you could turn the inverted off, but I actually like to leave the inverted on. And then I will control shift and select the principled shader to preview that. And if you zoom in, especially if you kind of look right there on the edges, you can see that it looks like those sci-fi details are popping out and they look a bit shiny. So we are almost done with this material, but there is one more thing that I want to do. I want to make the bolts more shiny, because right now if I control shift and select this roughness, the bolts aren't in that roughness, and so they're just going to be as rough as this texture is back here. And so I want to add the bolt texture into the roughness. So I will control shift and select the principled BSDF again. So what I'm going to do is press Shift A. Let's go to the search. And again, I can search for a mix RGB. And we're going to stick this mix RGB right here after this roughness. And then I can select the roughness, hold down the Shift key and select the mix. So both of these nodes are the roughness nodes. So I'm going to press Control J. Control J is going to add a frame. And then I can bring this over. And if I select the frame on the label, I can just call this roughness. So now I can control shift and select this mix shader to preview it. So I'm now going to take this lighten and I'm going to take the color and I'm going to plug this into color 2 of this mix. And then I just want to add the dark values. So on this mix RGB, I'm going to click on this mix and I'm going to instead change it to darken. And that way it's just going to add the dark values. So now if you zoom into one of the bolts, if I drag the factor all the way to 0, the bolts are invisible. But then if I drag the factor all the way up to 1, the bolts are very black. Now, if the texture is darker, that part is going to be more shiny. So if I control shift and select the principled BSDF, you can see if I drag this factor all the way down to 0, the bolts aren't very shiny, but then as I drag the factor up more and more, the bolts are going to become more shiny. So if I drag it all the way up to 1, it's very reflective and it kind of looks like a mirror, but I don't want it to be that shiny. I just want it to be somewhat shiny. So this factor, I'm going to change that to like a 0.7, change it to a 0.7, and now that bolt is more shiny. All right, so let's zoom out here and I'm going to select this displacement and I can press the M key and that is going to unmute it. So now we can preview the displacement. And there we go. So it really pops out the sci-fi plating and that looks very cool. They almost look like little CPU chips, CPUs in computers. They kind of look like that as well. That's pretty cool. And then also this wire going into the displacement is going underneath these bumps. So what I can just do is hold down the shift key, right click and drag, let go, and that's going to add the reroute. And I can just like drag this reroute down. I'm going to stick it down here and I can also bring the displacement down a little bit. So there is the finished procedural material. I'm going to press the N key to close the side panel. Let's also zoom out here and take a look at the finished material. All right, so that's it for the material. So I'm just going to give this a final render now. So there we have it. There is the procedural sci-fi metal plating material. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot from it and I hope you enjoyed it as well. And if you'd like to help support me and this channel, then you can purchase this procedural procedural material on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. I will have the links in the description, and you can also check out my Blender procedural material packs. And at the time of posting this video, I've just released Blender procedural material pack number 8, so the link will be in the description to that. And purchasing those material packs are a really great way to help support me and this channel. And if you'd like to learn how to create all of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist on YouTube. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and thank you for watching.